Hi, this is Dr. David Branham. Welcome. This is a video on the content for Chapter 4 in the research methods, the SOS 3305 class. This video, like the other videos, is pretty comprehensive, and I think it'll help you a lot on the test. It's not meant to replace the reading, but I think it'll be a good addition to it. You should be able to improve your test score by knowing the information on this video. So let's get started. I'll start by sharing my screen, and we'll get started on the presentation. The name of the chapter is The Research Process, Chapter 4, and it starts out with a basic outline of what scientific research is. And it says that scientific research is an iterative process of observation, rationalization, and validation. Now, this is only in the first chapter, basically, or the start of the chapter. And I think, though, that it's a very good outline of what is done in scientific research. One, in the observation phase, we observe a natural phenomena in our society, an event or a behavior, and we look and see what interests us, and we try to answer questions, to have theories about what's going on. So then we go that rationalization phase where we try to make sense of what's going on in society, and then we logically connect the different pieces of the puzzle together so that we can develop a theory of what's actually going on in our society. Then finally, once that theory is led to a construction, once that analysis has led us to a construction of a theory that we can test, then we get to the validation stage where we test our theories using the scientific method. And this is what we're going to really focus on in this chapter. It's the deductive research that we do in social sciences. Now, it's not the only kind of research. As you know, we have inductive research as well. But deductive research is the research that starts with a theory and then attempts to validate the theory through an analysis. This is the type of research that we do 80 or 90% of the time in the academic world of social sciences. It's the typical kind of research that we do. A lot of it is statistically based, although you don't have to do it in a statistical manner. There's other methods like case studies and so forth. But that is the main crux of what we do in social sciences. Most traditional research tends to be deductive and functionalistic in nature. It's not unusual for us to do this. And the chapter provides a schematic view of the deductive research project. And this figure depicts a series of activities to be performed in the functionalist research, categorized into three phases. Those three phases are exploration, research design, and then research execution. You can see these three phases here in the green, where exploration is where we start with research questions and theory, and then from there we develop a literature review. Then we go on to the research design, where we have operationalization. I'm having a hard time getting the words out. Operationalization of our constructs. It's very important and very difficult part of the research process. Our sampling strategy, for instance, if we're going to do survey research, we need to have a strategy on how to do that. And that comes together into a research method. And from that research method, we draw up a proposal. We don't always draw up a proposal, but every researcher has that proposal in his or her mind going forward. And it comes from these first two steps in the stages in the process. So from there, we go to the research execution stage, where we have our proposal. So we go to pilot testing, data collection, data analysis, and then report on our findings. And that report can be a conference presentation, a publication, a dissertation for your PhD. That's the type of report that we do. And that's the type of report that you're going to do for your paper in this class. Now, the exploration stage, to get into more detail, what you do is you select questions for further investigation in this stage. Research questions are specific questions about a behavior, an event, or a phenomenon of interest that you wish to seek answers to in your research. What, why, how, and when questions are formulated in these. What is going on here? Why is this happening? How is this coming about? These are the types of questions that you have in these research questions. If you focus on something like whether or not people vote, you could say, why do people go to the polls to vote? That may be a research question. Or how does something occur, or how do we make it where more people want to vote? So these questions are formulated in your mind as you go forward. These questions should address real and complex problems. Now, sometimes they seem like they're minor in nature, but answering a minor question can often have enormous impact. So when we say these questions need to be real and complex problems, they do need to be real and complex problems, but they may be very narrowly focused and help us answer questions. We go from a theory, and then we develop that theory over time as we learn more and more from our research. Second thing you do is do the literature review. Now, this is important for you to understand because the literature review is a big portion of your research paper that you're going to be doing in this class. There's 3 reasons why we do a literature review. One is to survey the current state of the knowledge in the area of inquiry. We don't need to repeat what somebody else has done. We need to add to the literature. We don't need to start from scratch when it's already been done. So we take that literature that's already been done and we put it into a literature review so we can show that this is where we are in the research process and this is where we need to take the next step. It also helps identify key authors, articles, theories, and findings in that area because you don't want to leave anything out. If you're going to be a research expert, you need to know the research on that area. And then you can, from there, identify the gaps in the knowledge in that research area. You say, oh, this is a part of this that really needs to be answered. This has been largely ignored. And those gaps are there, even in research areas that are highly paid attention to. A literature review is commonly done today using computerized keyword searches on online databases. For instance, you could do a lot of it on JSTOR, JSTOR, JSTOR. They have a website, university has a subscription to it. You can go through there and find academic articles because the literature review is not going to be magazine articles or newspaper articles. It's going to be literature from academic journals. That's what you're going to focus on. Academic journals and books. That's where you're going to get the major part of your literature review because that's where the publications are of the previous research on your subject area. So what you do is you go into JSTOR, or another one is Google Scholar. Go to Google Scholar. You can press in those keywords. You say, I want this and this, or I want this or this. And you can narrow down your search or expand your search on a short list of relevant topics that you have. And from there, you can find which articles you need. In most cases, you can get those articles and you can add them to your literature review. And you can have a focused literature review. The third step is to identify one or more theories that can help address the desired research questions. A literature review may uncover a wide range of potential theories related to the phenomena of interest, may even uncover 2 or 3 different papers when you do that. So these theories can come forth, and what you can do is develop a strategy for testing these theories in your research to find out if they are good for empirical testing to see if the evidence will tell you whether or not what you collect in your data will support or not support the theory in question. So that's what empirical testing does. So the research design, the second stage, this process is concerned with creating a blueprint of the activities done in order to satisfactorily answer the research questions identified for the exploration phase, which was the previous stage. This includes like selecting a research method, operationalization of the constructs of interest, and devising an appropriate strategy for sampling. This is a very important stage. And the reason why is in almost every case, researchers fail at this stage at some point, and then they find out that it's very costly to fail at this stage. For instance, if you're going to do a survey, you do survey research in order to answer your question. If you leave something out of your survey that's very important, then you have to basically go back and start all over again. It's very costly in time. It may be costly in money if you're getting funding for your research. So it's very important that you are very meticulous in this stage. Operationalization of the constructs are also an important part of this stage. It's very difficult to operationalize it, constructs in social sciences. Some constructs are easy, like for instance, gender. You just ask, are you male or female? And you get a response. Or you might be race. What is your race? You get a response. So those are labeled constructs that you can easily code. But other things in social sciences are a lot more difficult to code. And those need to have high attention. So selecting a research method, the researcher must decide what research method they wish to employ for collecting the data to address the research questions of interest. Now, this may be quantitative methods like an experimental design or quasi-experimental design, post facto research. It may be qualitative methods like case studies, or it might be a combination of that. But the important thing is that you select the right kind of methodology. And in a lot of cases, people are experts at a certain type of methodology, and then they bound themselves into that. So they'll only test using the methodology that they like. For instance, I had a professor that would only use, when I was in grad school, he would only use ordinary least squares regression to do any research. That did bound him. Now you could OLS regression it's pretty wide ranging. You can do a lot with it, but there are times when you need to be able to do more. For instance, if you're doing a time series analysis, you can't do time series analysis with regression, OLS regression. There are too many assumptions that get violated when you do that. The same is true, for different types of dependent variables. For instance, you might have a categorical dependent variable where it's like, who votes? Did you vote yes or did not vote no? Well, you can't do OLS regressions with that. And he would argue, I can do that and it works. And he was right most of the time, but it violates assumptions and there are better ways. So you need to be able to go on to better ways if you can. Don't be bounded in your research method by your own personal ability. Sometimes you need more training or better ways to do it. So you need to know what research you're going to do. And for instance, questions you might ask is, should I do an experimental design here? Well, in order to do experimental design, for instance, you have to be able to manipulate your independent variable. There's lots of independent variables that you can't manipulate. And in social sciences, these constructs that we'll talk about, for instance, dogmatism, you can't manipulate somebody's dogmatism. And that's problematic in experimental design. So you need to be able to adjust to that. If you're doing a survey, are you going to have a mail survey? Are you going to have a telephone survey or a web survey? Now, when I started in research, telephone surveys were the way to go. Now it's web surveys. Web surveys were at first had major biases in them, but the research that is done now has created web surveys where there's less bias. We can actually infer from the population to our sample to the population because we have taken painstaking steps to make sure that our samples look like the population. So the web surveys, which in the past were basically a no-no because they had so much bias. For instance, if somebody asks you to do a survey, that's in almost every case, there's some kind of selection bias there. Well, how did you get to that survey in the first place? Maybe you read an article or something like that. Now they have methods that have taken that away. And so they're continuously adopting new strategies to have better research. And so that's one of the things you always have to consider. Also note that, and I put this note in here myself, it's not in your book chapter, but note that the generalized design in figure 3.1, that stage process, is not a roadmap or a flowchart for all research. It only applies to functionalistic or deductive research, and it can and should be modified to fit the needs of the special project. So your particular paper is going to look like that stage process, but there are other ways to do it. And they just because they don't do that stage process, and when you see research, if it's not in that process, it doesn't mean you should discount it, but it is a good process, especially for functionalistic deductive research. It is a good process that gives legitimacy to your findings in your research. Construct measurement or operationalization is one of the most difficult things in social sciences. As I mentioned before, operationalization, is the process of designing precise measurements for abstract theoretical constructs. How are you going to precisely measure these concepts that we have that we want to measure? For instance, dogmatism. How do you measure how much dogmatism a person has? Or when we're talking about dogmatism, we're talking about very, very unacceptable and people who don't accept the opposite opinion of yours. Same is true for tolerance. How do you measure a person's tolerance? We've went through many iterations in the research process over the years to try to measure these constructs, and it's very difficult to measure them correctly. So it's very the constructs such as prejudice, I have it up here, prejudice, alienation, liberalism, they're really hard to define. And over time, we've had researchers who have worked very hard to develop good measures for them. It doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, but it's important that we understand what has been done in the past. So the process of operationalization is one, you create an operational definition. That's not easy. How do you define dogmatism? I had a hard time talking about it at the first part of this slide. How do you define that? How do you define racism or prejudice or alienation? The first thing you got to do is define it. And when you define it, you need to put it in the article. Somebody else may have a different definition than you, and that's okay. But at least when you're defining it, people can say, okay, this is what this researcher means when they're talking about prejudice, and this is how it's defined, and this is how this researcher measures it. So it requires that the researcher search the previous research to see if there are existing, already validated measures of that operational definition. If there are, you need to put that into account. You should start with what's generally been accepted. Now, it could be that you have a better adjustment for it. So you go from the generally accepted to an additional adjustment to make it even better. Or it may dictate that there are no measures available for this new construct that you're trying to measure, and you'll need to start from scratch. So if that's the case, you need to define it, measure it, adjust. And a lot of that, this usually means, one, that you get with people who are experts to tell you, okay, this is what you have here, looks like it's scientifically valid. And you also need to use some statistical methodology. For instance, a principal components factor analysis can tell you if your indicators of a concept are loading on a single concept or a single construct. Those statistical methods are there. So there should be some combination of this, of both. But if you're measuring something simple like gender, you can ask. And you can get that response from the survey question. Or if you're measuring something like, what is your ethnicity? You can ask. Those are easier to measure because those are just questions that you get a response. Measuring something like prejudice, much more difficult. Measuring something like tolerance, much more difficult. I had a professor who worked very hard to develop a good measure for tolerance. The problem with measuring tolerance is you can't ask a single question to somebody and take that answer and say, okay, this person is a tolerant person or not a tolerant person. What you have to do is go through a list of opinions and find out what that person's least like thing is among those opinions, and then see if they're tolerant of people who express that. Operationalizations of, for instance, prejudice in the past have been making assumptions about how people feel about people of different race. There are a lot of people who have different opinions of people of a different race. Some people think it's, for instance, that people of different race are no different from them, so that is the core of their opinion. Other people actually have preferences for people for certain races, sometimes of races that are different than their own. They actually have a preference for them. So you have to delve into what those preferences are, and then start asking questions to see how tolerant they are of people who have different opinions of them. And once you do that, then you have a better idea of how tolerant the person is. For instance, if you ask a liberal person how tolerant they are of people who carry a gun, a rifle on the back of their pickup truck, that may be a good measure of tolerance. Is it okay if a person carries a rifle on the back of their pickup truck? Well, I would never do that, would be one response. But if people want to do that, I'm fine with it. That's the sign of being a tolerant person, a person who has tolerance for people who have differing opinions than themselves. So it's very difficult to measure it, and it takes a lot of questions, takes a lot of delving into a person, and so forth. So these operationalization attempts, sometimes that means that you're going to have to go back and forth. It's very difficult, and it's one of the most problematic things in social science research. Sampling strategy. So all research has a unit of analysis. It's important for you to understand what your unit of analysis is before you begin. The typical unit of analysis is the person. If we do survey research, a person is the unit of analysis in almost every case. And what that person feels, what that person says, what that person does in his or her life, that is the crux of what you're using in your analysis. But it doesn't have to be your unit of analysis. A person doesn't have to be. It could be a school. It could be a corporation. It could be a country. There are many different units of analysis that you can have. So it's important that you understand, number one, what is your unit of analysis? In almost every methods class, the first question out when somebody proposes research, okay, what's your unit of analysis? So you need to be able to know that right away. So after that, once a unit of analysis is selected, you have to decide what your sample is going to be and where you're going to collect that data. For instance, so if a unit of analysis is a person, your sample may be a group of people, and then you will be actually surveying that group of people or coding that group of people. If your unit of analysis is a school, you may, for instance, I did an article on school infrastructure. My unit of analysis was the school, and my sample came from Houston Independent School District. So I basically took all the schools in Houston Independent School District. I had an analysis done of the infrastructure in those schools, and from those schools, I could tell from their infrastructure how good their attendance was, how good their dropout rate was, how good their test scores were. And so I could connect the infrastructure of their school to these dependent variables. If your unit of analysis is the individual, you collect data from each person. So you'll be doing the survey, asking that person questions or coding what that person does. In experimental design, you may not ask them any questions. You just look and observe and code what the person does. So reasonable care should be taken to avoid a biased sample. Your sample will have an impact on your results. If your sample, for instance, is only students, your research findings, people may say, well, they just did students. So this really only applies to students. So generalizing that to the population, those findings may be problematic if you have a sample that is biased, or it only includes some people. The psychology program at the University of Houston downtown, we use a lot of experimental design of our students. The good thing is our students have wide variance in their different demographic data. We have a lot of diversity as far as race and ethnicity in the school. And we also have a lot of diversity in age. So the diverse population allows us to create a sample, measure that sample in experimental design, and do a better job of generalizing that to the population at large, with the argument that our population at UHD looks a lot like the population at other in society itself. So our research proposal, at this stage, it's often a good idea to write a research proposal detailing all the decisions made in the preceding stages. So you say, okay, this is my proposal, this is what I want. If you're getting funding, you almost certainly will have to have this proposal saying, I'm going to have this, answer this question, I'm going to use this methodology, this is how I'm going to collect my data, this is how I'm going to operationalize my constructs, and so forth. That plan goes down in a research proposal. And funding agencies, if they want to fund your research, for instance, you need money for a survey, those funding agencies are going to read that proposal. Even if you're not getting funding, it's usually a good idea to do this proposal. Everyone has this proposal in research. Sometimes they don't put it down on paper, though. They have it in their head. If it's on paper, though, you can run it by other people and get their input, experts, and say, okay, maybe you're forgetting this. Maybe you need to add this, or maybe this perspective is something you need to consider. That is a great thing, because once you get past the proposal stage and then you get into that actual analysis, making mistakes during the analysis will have high costs. So even if funding isn't sought for a research project, a proposal may serve as a useful vehicle for seeking feedback and identifying potential problems with the research project. Whether some important constructs were missing from the study, for instance, or whether you missed the perspective, or maybe you're just measuring incorrectly. This needs to start before you collect your data, because if you start collecting your data and then discover you have this problem, then it becomes very costly. The initial feedback is invaluable because it's often too late later on to correct these problems. Another thing that you can do is in your research design, a lot of times, once you start your sampling and doing your research collection, a lot of times it's a good idea to just do a small sample and then do your data analysis with a small sample to see, because sometimes when you see that, you can see, oh, I'm leaving something out, or something's going on that I didn't suspect. So I highly suggest that, especially with survey research. If you plan on doing survey research of 1,000 people, start by doing the survey research of 50 people. Do the 50 people, do the analysis that you plan, and see, okay, you may not have the outcomes that you want, but you can look at that analysis and say, am I missing something? Is something going on that I didn't consider? I mean, that's a great way to save yourself. If you collect all 1,000 and then you have this question, am I missing something? You basically have to throw out all of your data. So you don't want to throw out 1,000 surveys. You want to throw out 50. So that's a very important. Having decided who to study, what to measure, and how to collect data, the research is now ready to proceed to the research execution phase. That's the last phase. It includes pilot testing, the measurement instruments, data collection, and data analysis, and then the publication at the end. So data collection is executed according to the research design. All of it is pre-planned. After the data collection is over, the data is then analyzed and interpreted for the purpose of drawing conclusions regarding the research questions of interest. So if you do a survey, you complete your survey. And for instance, if you're doing OLS regression, that's your plan in your research process, you run your regression, then you see what your results are. Depending on the type of data collected, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, data analysis may be quantitative, experimental design, regression, structural equation modeling. It could be post facto design, where it's from the field, or it could be qualitative. It could be case studies and so forth. That execution is the last part of it that you do, excuse me, before you analyze, and then you publish what your research findings are. Research reporting. The final phase is the research reporting, where you have to actually produce a document that is the research publication. And this is basically what you're going to do for your assignment in this class. A deductive reasoning quantitative report, which is what is done in this class, is in social sciences is typically reported in the following fashion. This is the order, and this is an order that you're going to do your paper in. So be sure to understand this. One, you'll have an introduction, which outlines why your research is important. This is a really important section. It's a small section, but it's a really important section because it's the first thing people read, and it's what people, when people decide, is this really an important question or not? If you have a really important question that you're not able to express the importance of that, then most people will set your research aside, and then there's going to be a lot of work thrown away. So this is an important section. But then the next section, the literature review, which we've outlined earlier, is also presented. You're basically telling people, this is what's been done before. This is why we need to take this next step in this research process. And this justifies us doing this research. Third section is that methods section, which outlines in detail the research process. Basically, every step that you take is in that methods section. The theory you use, the constructs that you select, how you're measuring those variables to create those variables. Constructs vary back and forth. How did you do that? How did you collect your sample? And so forth. All of that is in the method section. You make it where a person can just read this section and replicate your study. They can see what every step that you've done. They can test the findings. They can assess whether the inferences you derived were scientifically acceptable. It's important that there's complete transparency in the method section. So then after the method section, where you basically say, this is what we did, this is what we theorized, this is how we tested it, the results section comes out and tells exactly what the result of this analysis was. Fifth, now this is the part that I'm going to give you in your paper, this results section, this fourth section. You're not going to have to write this results section because this is something that you really do in your statistics class. And this is a methodology class. You have a statistics class after this, where you're really going to focus a lot on results, how to do that analysis and so forth. So I'm actually giving you that part of this paper for this class, and you will not be graded on it. But the method section, I'm going to tell you everything that's going to be done, and you're going to have to create that method section yourself. Then the fifth and final part is the discussion and conclusion. So basically in this section, you say, okay, this is what we found. This is something we need to think about. It's what is the impact of these results? A lot of times they talk about what's the next step in the research process? Because you may have answered one part of the theory, but your results have also created another question that you can express here in your discussion question. And it tells us, okay, we've gotten here. Maybe this is the next step in the research process. Mistakes made in research. The research process is fraught with problems and pitfalls, and novice researchers often find, after investing a whole lot of time into doing research that they have made mistakes, and it's created an impossibility for them to have a successful research project. If you don't follow scientifically accepted methods, if you leave out things that are important, problems like these typically result in research papers that get rejected by journals. Sometimes they're really, if leaving out something that you just obviously have to have, basically means you're going to throw your paper in a trash can, and may mean you have to start from scratch with the data collection and so forth, because you're going to have to revise what you did in order to make your research project legitimate. By far, though, the worst mistake in research is the insufficiently motivated research question. Oftentimes, we choose our problems and are interested. They're interesting to us, but they're really not interesting to the scientific community. They don't really have an impact. And when you do that, you can't justify a publication, even if your results are there. If you did a perfect methodology, you've done your literature review, if the results actually have no impact, then that's a mistake that you're not going to be able to overcome. So it's important to publish answering questions that are important to society. And it's important, once again, go back to that introduction. When you write your introduction, you have to make sure that people understand why your paper is important. So the introduction is a very important part of your paper. That is all that I have for chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed the video. I think this video will really help you on your test as far as the information on your test. I hope you have a good day. I am going to stop my share and remind you that you can email me. Email me is usually the easiest way to get me. If you want to schedule a Zoom meeting, if you want to talk, or if you just need answers to questions that you can answer by email, I'm always happy to do that. So don't hesitate to do that. Once again, have a great day. Thank you for the video, seeing the video.